All right, let's talk about two words you've probably heard a million times: colonialism and imperialism. Now, these aren't just dusty old terms from a history textbook. No way. These were incredibly powerful forces that literally redrew the map of the world. So today, we're going to unpack what they really mean, and we'll do it by looking at one of the biggest, most impactful examples ever: the British Raj in India.
So, how did a couple of ideas become powerful enough to build massive empires and completely shape the lives of millions and millions of people? I mean, really think about that. That's the big question we're tackling here. And to do that, we first have to get our definitions straight. All right, so first things first. People throw the words colonialism and imperialism around like they're the same thing. And while they're definitely related, they are not interchangeable. They're distinct ideas, and trust me, getting the difference is absolutely key to understanding, well, a huge chunk of modern history.
So let's put them side by side. What's the real difference here? How do these two massive ideas actually connect? Let's break it all down.
Okay, let's kick things off with colonialism. The key word here is practice. Think of it as the how-to guide. It's the physical, hands-on act of one country taking political control over another. It often involves sending your own people to settle there, and here's the really crucial part: exploiting its resources, its land, its people, its wealth, all for the benefit of the home country. So what does that actually look like when it happens? Well, you've got direct political control. The colonizer basically sets up their own government. Then there's the economic exploitation. We're talking about grabbing all the valuable raw materials and using cheap labor. You also see cultural domination, where the colonizer's language, religion, and customs get pushed on everyone else. And of course, there's settlement, which almost always means pushing the local people out of the way. Now let's switch gears to imperialism. If colonialism is the practice, imperialism is the idea behind it. It's the grand policy, the ambition to extend your nation's power and influence out into the world. And here's a key difference. It doesn't always mean you have to go and settle a place. You can be imperialistic just through military threats, or by using economic muscle, or even through clever diplomacy. And here's where it all clicks into place. Think of it like this. Imperialism is the overall policy. It's the big idea, the blueprint for building an empire. Colonialism is the practice. It's the boots on the ground action, the actual building of a colony. So you could say colonialism is one of the most important tools in the imperialist toolbox. It's the how to imperialism's why. Okay, that's enough with the abstract definitions, right? Let's see how this all played out in the real world. And for that, we're diving into our case study, the British Raj. This was the period of British rule over the Indian subcontinent, stretching all the way from the mid-1700s to 1947. This is where the theory gets very, very real. So the big question is, how on earth did a relatively small island nation manage to control a massive, sprawling subcontinent for almost 2 centuries? Well, they built a machine, a really complex machine of control with all these economic, political, and cultural levers that were all designed for 2 things: to maintain power and to extract wealth. And right at the heart of this machine was its economic engine. Let's be really clear about this. From the British point of view, the #1 reason for having the colony was profit. It's often called the drain of wealth, and that's a perfect description. It was like a giant pipeline where India's incredible resources just flowed steadily, one way, straight to Britain. So how did they pull this off? It wasn't just one thing. It was a whole strategy. First, they took all the raw materials they could, things like cotton, tea, and opium, and shipped them back to fuel British factories. Second, they set up a monopoly on trade, which absolutely devastated local Indian industries like their world-famous handloom weavers. And third, they put in place these really harsh tax systems designed to squeeze every last drop of revenue out of the land and the people working it. And take a look at this table. It shows you just how organized and systematic they were about it. You had different systems, but they all did the same job. In one system, they'd use local landlords as their tax collectors. In another, they'd tax the farmers directly. And in a third, they'd make an entire village responsible for the payment. But no matter how they did it, the goal was always exactly the same: get as much money as possible for the British government. Now, obviously, you can't pull off that level of economic exploitation without having a tight grip on things. You need a solid political and military structure to back it all up.
You need bureaucrats to run the system and soldiers to enforce the rules. So let's look at how the Raj was actually put together.
And this timeline here shows a really critical moment. In 1857, there was a huge rebellion, and it was a massive wake-up call for the British. It basically shook their whole system to its core. In response, they completely changed how they did things. They got rid of the East India Company, which had been running the show, and the British Crown took direct control from London. Suddenly, you had a formal, centralized government, and British laws, like the Indian Penal Code, were rolled out everywhere. This was the point where colonialism in India went from a corporate project to a full-blown government-run empire.
But how do you justify all this to yourself and to the world? Well, you come up with a powerful story, an ideology. And that's exactly what happened. As this quote gets at, the British pushed this idea that they were on a civilizing mission. The narrative was that Indian culture was somehow inferior and needed to be lifted up. This became the moral-sounding excuse for the whole colonial project. So, the British Raj officially ended in 1947, but that doesn't mean its story is over. Not even close. The impact of that era didn't just vanish. All those structures, all those decisions, all those ideas, they've left these deep, lasting echoes that are still shaping India, and honestly, the rest of the world to this very day.
And the negative legacy is pretty stark. You're talking about an Indian economy that was effectively deindustrialized, a farming population that was driven into poverty by those brutal tax systems, a whole society that had foreign laws and culture forced on it, and, crucially, a society that was left with deep divisions, many of which were created or made worse by colonial policies. But history has a funny way of being ironic, doesn't it? Because the very things the British built to control India ended up helping to kick them out. Think about it. The railways they built to move troops and raw materials, well, they also connected people from all over the subcontinent, helping to forge a new unified Indian identity. And that new educated class they created to help run the empire, they're the ones who ended up using their English education to argue for independence.
And all of this leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. The story of the British Raj is such a powerful reminder that history is never really in the past. It's alive. The economic systems, the national borders, even some of the cultural conflicts that were set up during the Age of Empire, they are still very much with us, influencing our world right now. So the real question for you and me is, where do we see the echoes of these empires still at work all around us today?